Hello and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to use Luminar to create a vintage look with a texture overlay so that you can go from this to this within a couple of minutes. Let's get going. Okay, so here we are inside of Luminar. This is the new Luminar 3 with libraries. So I've talked about that before, but what I've done is I've created a quick little collection of some images that I took in India because I thought they'd be really applicable for applying textures because there's texture everywhere there. So I wanted to add some more texture to a few of my images. So once we are inside Luminar, I've already created this image. So I went from the before, which looked like this, to the after image, the finished completed image, which looks like this. Okay, so rather than show you how I did this one, I'm going to show you how I did it on one of my other images. So the first thing that you want to do, this one is very similar. It's the same guy. This is in Varanasi, India. And he is an Agori medicine man or a shaman, religious man. I can't think of the word. So he came with all of the props and everything, and this is part of his religion. So we photographed him both on the shore and in the boat. So what I did first is I want to make sure you do all your raw editing first. So you can see on the side panel here, I've done all of my raw adjustments already. So the original image looked like that. It was a little bit flat and I wanted more color in the sky. So I've already done the edits that I wanted to do to the image first before I start applying any of the textures or the black and white. Okay, so do that first. If you are not sure how to do that, I've already got another video on raw processing using Luminar. It's demonstrated with the Luminar 2018, but I'll put a link for it below this video so that you can go and have a look. Okay, so all the same tools apply in Luminar 3 if you've now upgraded. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is click the little plus sign over here by the layers and add an adjustment layer. So I don't want to play around with any of the stuff I've done to the image already. I want to leave it the way it is and not have to worry about editing it or touching it by mistake. So I'm going to add a new layer, and anything that I'm going to add on top of it will only apply to this layer. Okay, so let me just turn off my side panel here so you can just see the image. Okay, so you can do things like you could turn off your Luminar looks. They used to be called presets, now they're called looks. And you can turn off the little film strip on the side so that you can get a bigger image area when you're working. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you how I do it, and then we're going to create some presets so that if you like the look, you can easily create it again yourself quickly. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is I'm going to add a grain filter. Now I've created some favorites and I've bookmarked the ones that I like. So I'm going to add the grain filter, and I'm going to add a texture overlay. And I want to also add curves, and I'll show you why when we get to the end. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a little bit of grain. Okay, so grain is sort of that noisy look. It makes your image look like it's shot with film back in the day when we were shooting film. And you could play around with the amount, the size, and the roughness until you get a look that you like. Okay, so that's the first part of creating an image that looks a bit more vintage, is adding that little bit of grain. Okay, the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a texture layer. So the texture overlay filter, what it does is it gives you a place to load a texture image. Okay, so you can find textures free on the internet. You can create them yourself from images that you shot of textured, walls, peeling paint, wood, that kind of thing. Okay, but there's quite a lot of resources that you can find available for free on the internet. I'll give you a link to a few if you haven't got any textures of your own already so that you can play around. So what I did was I downloaded a few free ones ahead of time, and I put them in this little folder called textures. So what I do normally is I just kind of scroll through them and I'm looking for one that kind of has a look that I think will go nicely with this image. Something that maybe's got some scratches, maybe it matches the tone of the image, that kind of thing. Okay. if I want to, I can also make the image black and white. Okay, so let's try one that looks like this. Okay, so I'm going to use one that's already black and white. Okay, when it comes on, so it's not going to apply any color to the image. Okay, so I want to keep the color in the image, but I want to make it look vintage. Okay, so the texture itself has no color. And if you have textures that already are in color, you can make a black and white version of them as well. So right out of the gate, it doesn't look so great, but this is where the magic starts to happen, is you have full control of how this texture is going to look using these settings. Okay, so under the little menu here, I'm going to choose blend and pick a different one. So you'll notice as I scroll through them, it gives you a preview of what it's going to look like if you choose that blend mode. Okay, so just a quick overview here. Anything that's in the darkened section, you'll notice that there's divider lines. Anything that's in the darkened section, anything that's in the texture that's darker than the original image, that's where it's going to show up. And it's not going to show up so in areas of him or his clothes, for example. Okay, so all of these are looking for darkening. The lighten one is opposite. So any areas in the texture image that you've added that are lighter than the original image, that's where it's going to show up here. In the overlay section, so overlay, soft light, and hard light, what it's doing is it's going to add contrast. Okay, so you'll notice that it is more contrasty now. I tend to like soft light, okay, and that's doing kind of a nice look. So let's pick that one. Now you have a few things that you can do here. You can flip the texture image up and down, okay, and back and forth. So you can decide how you want it to appear on the image. Right? You can also enhance it, so you can show more of it, or you can show less of it, dial it down a little bit. Now, if you go the other way to the minus side, it's actually going to be sort of inverse, right? I wouldn't go that way unless you have a texture that's sort of really dark, and it'll show up opposite, right? So that's looking okay, right? Now, if you want to make the texture larger, you can do that. You can make it smaller, but if you make it too small, you can see that it's now not fitting the whole picture. Okay, so don't go smaller than 0 because it's going to automatically fit the whole picture. And then you can zoom it larger than that if you want. Okay. The other thing that you can do is you can mask off certain areas. So for example, if I don't want it showing on him, or I don't like maybe this bit up in the sky or something, I can mask it off. Right? So you can choose the little brush here, and you can do that by an adjustment brush, a radial mask, a gradient mask, or a luminosity mask. Okay, so I'm going to do it by brush, and I'm going to choose erase up at the top menu here. So erase assumes that I want to leave everything that's there, and I only want to take away a couple of bits. Okay, then I'm going to lower the opacity to about 30%. I almost never paint at 100% for anything, so I'm just going to remove a little bit of this texture in the sky here, maybe a little bit down here. And for just good measure, I'm going to make sure it's not on his face. Okay, so it's not making a huge change. If I change this opacity to 100%, you'll see what happens. You can see that it's going to erase the whole area. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that. Let's leave that. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now, if I like that, we can call it a day. I find that it's actually a little bit too contrasty for a vintage look. So when you have a vintage type of image, often they're faded out. Okay, so you can do a couple of things. You can add a black and white layer, which we could have done before adding the texture. Or you can add a curves filter and do something like this. So this left corner is the blacks, and when you drag it up to on the left-hand side, what it's doing is it's telling it to push. See how the graph is sort of getting pushed over? It's telling the program, I don't want pure black. I want the darkest thing in my picture to be not quite black. So it kind of gives you that sort of matte black look. And if I want to bring the highlights back down, I can do something like that. Okay, so it just kind of shows that you can adjust the contrast to make it look a little bit more faded out. I think I would like to have this image as a black and white as opposed to color. So there's a couple ways we can do that. I'm going to add another adjustment layer. And I'm going to choose the black and white filter, black and white conversion. Okay, and now you can sort of choose what look you want. And you get to decide, you know, where you set your tonal range. So I want to darken the blues or lighten the blues. Let's darken the yellows. Okay. Then you can also lower the effect of this so that you have sort of a faded colored picture, just leaving a little bit of the color, right? Something like that. And you can do that by this slider at the bottom here, the filters amount, because I've only got one filter, it's only applying on that one. Or you can do it on the opacity of the layer. Okay, so if you have multiple filters, it will apply to all of them. So you get to decide sort of how much color you want coming through, right? The other thing you can do is you can name your layers. So how I'm doing that is I'm just right-clicking on the layer. And I'm going to call it texture layer. And I'm going to call this one black and white layer. Oops. Just so that I can easily see what each of them are doing. Okay, so when I go back to the texture layer, it kind of hides the black and white layer for the moment, but it allows me to go back and edit anything I want. So this is called non-destructive editing. The original image is still on the bottom layer. I haven't done anything to it. It lives on my hard drive. It's unedited. So all I'm doing is applying some things in here that tell the program, this is how I think I'd like this image to look. Okay? And only when I'm done and I save it, will it then apply that into a new JPEG. So now that I've got the black and white layer, I'm going to play with some of these other textures that had a bit more color in them. Let's try this one, because I didn't want the color coming over or into the image, right? So let's make sure that is nice and strong. Play around with your blend modes again. Let's go with something a bit stronger. Okay, now when you go back to the black and white layer, you can still see that the texture is there, but it's now applied it into black and white. Okay? And if I want to put the black and white layer below it, I just dragged it underneath. Okay, now when I go to my texture layer, okay, it's still got that muted color, but I can turn on the texture layer. Okay, let's make sure that's applied. Okay, so there's my texture again. Okay. So you could reorder again the layers just by simply dragging one underneath the other and it will pop it down, okay? So there's our before and there's our after. Okay, now I'm going to show you another trick. So something that I've already done with some images that I created earlier, including the one I showed you at the beginning, is I now can save that as a new Luminar look. Okay, so if I'm on this layer, it's going to save whatever I've done on this layer. So it's going to save the grain, the texture, and the curves. Okay, if I want to have the black and white as part of it, then I would want to put the black and white on this layer, okay, as opposed to putting it on the other layer. So that it would save everything together. Okay, so let's just try that. Okay, I'm going to turn that black and white layer off. And by turning the layers off, all I'm doing is I'm hitting these little icons. So when the eyeball has a slash through it, it just means it's not showing. Okay, so I'm just turning it off, literally. So let's add that black and white filter back in, the conversion. Let's do the look that we want. Darken the yellows a little bit. Okay, so now because this one is a filter, okay, if I dial down the filters at the bottom, it's also going to affect my texture. So it's affecting everything. Okay, if I only want to dial back the opacity of this one, I have to dial back, either I change the blend mode or I have to go in here and just add a bit of saturation back. So I think I would like, you know, just a little bit of saturation, and you can do that per color even. Okay, so if you want a little bit of blue, let's dial them all back to about 25% or so and see how that looks. I'm doing really rough numbers here. Okay. And you can also do things on the black and white layer, like adjusting your highlights and your shadows and so on. Okay, so play with that until you're happy with the color. Okay, so now I'm going to save this as a new look. So there's our before and after, right? I'm going to click this at the bottom right of my screen that says Save Luminar Look. And I've already saved 3 with this name, so I'm going to call it Vintage Texture number 4. And I'm just going to call it Varanasi because that's where I shot it. Okay, So now it's saved it down at the bottom. So under the Luminar looks at the bottom, which are all the presets, collections and things, there's a bunch of downloadable ones for free on the Skylum website. You can find a bunch more online, which I've done here, and you can even buy some from other people. But any that you create are going to be in this user Luminar looks folder, right? So that's where they are saved, right? So I'm going to go back to the library, and a lot of keyboard shortcuts that apply in other softwares also apply here in Luminar. So I just hit the G key and I went back to what's called the grid or the library view to see all the thumbnails that are in this little album. Okay, so I've got a couple of others that I've already played with, and I want to show you if we want to mask a little more, like if I want to play with things like a luminosity mask. I did that with this one, okay? So a luminosity mask, what that does is it kind of does an automatic mask for you based on the tones in the image. Okay, so this one has a lot of dark and a lot of light, and I wanted most of the texture to apply on the light areas and not on the dark areas, so it was really applicable for me to do the luminosity mask. Okay, so let's have a look once it's loading up here. So it's loading all my presets. All right, so let's see what I've got here. I'm going to pick a texture. I think I've got a texture already applied here, but I want to make sure. Okay. Let's see, let's pick a new texture. And I'm going to pick one that has quite a lot of texture because I really want it to show up in the sky, and I want this image to look really sort of like old. That looks pretty good. Let's go back to that one. Okay, let's try this one. See what that looks like. Okay, so it's not so strong, right? So maybe it's not showing up exactly where I want it. Let's try overlay. There we go. Okay, so if in doubt, change your blend mode. Okay, if you're not sure what it's doing, you can hit the eyeball off and on. You can see that it's subtle. I'm just going to turn these off so you can see the image bigger. Okay, so you can see what it's doing. Okay, so without the texture and with the texture, right? Because it's kind of adding that warmth from the texture screen. Now if I make it a lot bigger, let's see what happens. Okay, so I can apply it stronger. I can actually zoom in to the texture. I can flip it, see if it looks like there's a better area. Okay, now I want to show you a little trick here because the luminosity mask is really cool. Okay, let's see what other blend modes do. Oh, the lighten. Okay, so this is where it's really going to come into play. So I'm going to choose lighten because it really is kind of lightening too much around the dark areas here. And I'm going to pick a different texture because I was playing with one earlier that works really well for this image, and I can't remember which one it was. So if you're playing around with textures and you end up with hundreds and hundreds of them, sometimes it can be hard to find the right one. All right, let's try this one. Okay, so that one's got a lot of sort of rusty tones. Okay, so I'm going to apply it even as a normal. So it's going to apply everywhere on the image, okay? And I'm going to flip that upside down. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to apply a luminosity mask. Okay, so under the brush, little brush pull down here, I'm going to choose luminosity. So it's going to make the luminosity mask for you automatically. It takes a second, so we just wait for it. And then what should happen, if it's working correctly, is the dark areas will be masked out, meaning the texture will not apply to the dark areas as much as it's applying to the light areas. Okay. Okay, so there's our mask. Okay, so it's definitely done that. So you can see that it's applying a lot more to the center of the image than it is to the outside. Okay, now if we change the texture, it should do the same thing on whatever other texture because the luminosity mask is already there, right? It won't change anything. There's the one at the front, at the top, like. So it's handy to actually have lots of textures because they don't always work. Not all textures will work on all images. Let's see, let's try that one. Okay, so it's kind of subtle on this one, but it actually looks nice because the wall was blue and now it's kind of showing this blue, right? So you could just decide if that's good, if you want to mask it some more, if you want to add the strength. Everything is totally flexible and you control the look of it, right? Now I did create a custom look for a couple of things. Now this one I did as a preset or a look, okay? So I've saved it as a look. So once again, I've processed the image from the raw file into how I want it to look. You know, I've adjusted the color, the contrast, exposure, and so on. So once you're happy with your image, do those things first before you start applying things like black and white, grain, and texture, okay? So always get your raw image processed first. Okay, so now I'm just going to go open these little presets at the bottom here. Okay, so I actually made one called the Taj. Now remember, before you apply anything on top of the processing, always add an adjustment layer, okay? Because then it's really easy to undo it. So if you apply a bunch of stuff and then you decide you don't like it, you can either go back in the history and undo, 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 or if you've applied it as an adjustment layer, just delete the layer. It's really that simple, okay? So I'm going to apply the one that I saved on this one that I did earlier, right? Now notice that it applied the texture and then it sort of disappeared. And what I found is that you sort of have to reselect it because the preset will apply the overlay filter for you, but it doesn't necessarily know which image you want to apply. So you have to just go repick the image and there it is, okay? So I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, that gives a really nice grunge type of look to the Taj Mahal. So that's my original image. It was also crooked a little bit. So I straightened it out, punched up the contrast. So you picked up the reflection and now it's kind of got this looming, dooming, you know, texture in the sky. Okay? Very cool. Let's have a look at one more. Okay, so I did this fellow. So he's a fellow that I met at the Pushkar Camel Fair, and he just had such a really interesting face. So the images that you select to add a texture to, they need to be appropriate. So you want to pick something that if you're adding, you know, a texture to make it look vintage or antique, that there's already some element of something that looks old in the picture, or it could be a person, but if they're wearing modern clothes, it might not really suit the image. So I've chosen this fellow because he's wearing really traditional camel herder gear and a turban and the whole thing. He's got a modern shirt, but you see very little of it, right? So I've chosen him. Let's see what he looked like to start. So that's the original image, right? So I've chosen him to add my texture to. So I've already applied a black and white layer, and I'm going to make one more. So let me just rename this one black and white layer. And we're going to name this one texture layer. Okay, so once again, I've got some presets, so I can try the ones that I've already used before just by clicking on them. Okay, now because I've done this on a new layer, it's not going to do anything except apply those filters, and I can change it easily. Okay, so I can choose the next one. Let's see what it looks like. Well, that's kind of nice. So it's added a little bit of color to that one. Let's see the Taj. Let's go with this one. Okay, so a couple things I want to show you where we can customize this a little bit. Because the original image is so vibrant color, if you want a little bit of the color showing through, there's a couple of ways to do that. Okay, so we can go to our black and white layer, and you can actually just change the opacity of the layer. Okay, so you can have a little bit of color show through. Like that. You can decide how much, right? So it's just faded out. Or you can do the filters amounts. It does the same exact thing, okay? So I'm going to go about 65%. Now when I go back to the textures layer, it's going to apply the texture again, but it's still going to have a little bit of color coming through. So if I decide that's not enough, I can just go back and change that, right? Now if I'm doing it from here, it's easier because I can get to that layer opacity easier. Let's go about 50%. Oh, see, I got the wrong layer. I went too far. Let's go this one. Make sure you're grabbing the right layer and the right slider. But that's, again, the beautiful thing about it is it's non-destructive editing. So you really can't screw it up, right? So let's go about there. Go back to the texture layer. And then you should see some of that color coming through. So if you decide the texture is too heavy, okay, You can lower it, right, with the slider and the amount slider. You can mask it in the areas you don't want it showing. So if you don't want it on his face, we can mask it so that it's not applying to his face. Let's try a different texture. Let's try one that's got some scratches and stuff. It looks like it's an old photo. And you can actually find some really cool textures that have scratches and things like that. Let's try this one. Not bad. I'm not crazy about it. So you really have to just try stuff. It's all about playing around, seeing what works, and finding a particular style for your own image and for your own work. Okay? So I don't do textures a lot, but I do find that there's certain images that really, really work well for textures. Okay. So find the one you want. I'm just going to apply it strong so you can see it on his face. And let's check our blend mode. Maybe let's go a little stronger. Okay, so if we go strong like that, you can see really obviously we don't want it on his face or on certain areas. So now this is where I'm going to apply the brush to get rid of it on those areas by using the brush and erasing. Again, I almost never paint with 100% opacity. I go down to about 50%, and I'll do it in a few strokes. Okay, so I'm just start painting, and you can sort of see that the texture is now going away from those areas. And I may want a little bit of texture, but I certainly don't want it as much on his face and on his neck as it is here, right? Let's see how that looks. Sometimes it takes a second for the program to catch up to my painting if I paint too fast. So something like that. Okay, so when you're happy with it, you just click done. Okay, and there's your new texture. Okay, so let's see on this one. If I've done a lot of grain, maybe I want to increase the grain, or maybe I want to adjust the curves. So I did adjust the curves a little bit on this one. Okay, and now this one has black and white conversion here as well as on the previous layer, so we're sort of duplicating ourselves there. Ah, there we go. Okay. There. So really, it's sort of a dance between all of the things working together. It's a dance between originally doing your raw processing, getting the image to look how you want it, doing any black and white conversion that you want to do, and then adding your texture layer. Okay, so there's my final image. Let's take away these guys. Let's see how it looks. Here's the before, and there's the after. Okay, so that is completely the image as it is out of camera, and that's what it looks like with the black and white texture. The other way you can do sort of before and afters, if you just want to see what the texture layer is doing, is just turn that layer off. Remember, use the eyeball. Okay, if you want to see what the black and white layer is doing, turn that one off. Okay, so maybe I want all the color to come back. Okay, so you can see how subtle it is. Okay, so at the bottom line is you get to decide how your images look, and I'm just going to run through the steps again for applying the textures. Let's do a real quick one on this guy here. So the first thing you want to do is process your image with the raw processing device or the raw develop filters, right? I use the professional workspace, so it gives me all the options. So this one actually looks pretty good right out of the gate. I'm not going to do a lot to this one, so we just want to apply that. Okay, and the second thing you're going to do is add an adjustment layer. Okay, create a black and white if you want to convert it to black and white. Play around with how the colors look. Let's go with that one. Okay, so you get to decide. Darken his shirt a little bit. Okay, and then finally add your texture layer. So you can do that if you created some presets. You can do that, let's say, with this one. And then just pick your texture. Okay. some of the textures I do find, and depending on the blend mode you choose, also do add contrast. So you really have to kind of play around with the contrast and the amount that you're applying, the blend mode. Okay, so once you choose your image, choose the blend mode that looks the best, play around till you're happy with it, flip it up and down till you get it in the position you like, change the amount up and down, right? And then you can add your grain, and you can apply a curve if you like. Okay, so this one's already got a curve. I'm just gonna make it a little more matte, right? So there's your before and after, and because I created a couple of looks or presets, whatever you want to call them, it was pretty quick to add the texture layer and the black and white, right? So play around with textures. I hope you have some fun with it, and do share some of your textured images in the comments below and let me know how you're making out. If you have any questions, I'll try and answer them there for you as well. So take care, and until next time, I'll have another tutorial for you in a few weeks. I'll see you then.